Good morning, Daniel.
Welcome back, Dan.
Isn't that usually my line?
Yeah, but you've been gone most of the week.
Oh, in my defense, I was at a conference. So, what are we talking about today?
The cost of hiring staff, valuing a business, retirement benefits for business owners, and I think we're going to squeeze in succession and transition planning.
Welcome to the Science of Wealth, where we discuss the science behind financial planning and the art of learning and applying it. Okay, well, I guess we will have to talk fast this morning, but that's pretty easy to do. Cost of hiring staff, hit me. What kind of costs are we talking about?
Sure. So, first and foremost, I want to read a quote that says, ultimately, growth is not a business decision in my eyes, it's a mandate. And that's a quote from one of your blogs from October 24th of 2023. And before we even dove into the cost of hiring staff, I wanted to ask you, if you could elaborate on, that quote and why you see it as more of a mandate than a business decision.
So, growth is something that is going to happen in any successful functioning business because the results compound upon themselves, right? You do good work for one client, that client tells other people, those people come and express interest, you do good work for those people. So you're likely to see an increase in interest and volume over time if your product or your service is strong. But then also, the world is constantly a changing thing, right? Inflation happens, supply and demand chains change, technology improves. And so you could start a business with the intention and the aspiration of always being solo, always being just on your own, so on and so forth, where growth might not take the form of hiring people or of expanding your headcount or your staff, but it may take the form of steadily improving the ratio of costs or revenue to the number of clients you serve. So, let's say you're a lawyer and your first year you'll just take anybody, and so you work with 30 or 40 different clients on 30 or 40 different cases, and you're charging $250 an hour, and you want to stay solo. You don't want to hire people. It behooves you then the next year to say, hey, I'm going to try to reduce the number of cases I work on, but I'm going to raise my hourly rate to make up the difference. There's an expression out there, and I get a chuckle out of it every time I hear it, but essentially the expression goes, if you doubled your prices, you'd lose half your clients. And then do your math and realize, oh, you're going to have the same amount of money for half the work. So growth is sort of a natural state for any business that is successful, that is well run, that is providing a good quality product or service. Plenty of businesses fail, so there's always an issue there. But if you have a business and you are doing it well through no fault of your own, don't be surprised if the numbers keep getting bigger and bigger and the demands on the business get bigger and bigger, unless you're being very conscientious and deliberate about avoiding scope creep or growth of the practice.
Okay. So, naturally, you're going to grow, and sometimes when you grow, that requires, hiring additional staff and headcount to help you with some of those tasks. So, for me, not a business owner, the first thing that comes to mind is salary. You are going to pay this new individual a sum of money, and that's the cost or expense you're going to incur from hiring them. But in addition to that, what else am I missing? What other expenses are you going to incur when you hire a new employee?
I mean, obviously, the hourly wage or the commission rate or the salary is going to be a big factor. Right away, you need to throw another 7.65% on top of that for payroll taxes. You also have to factor in unemployment taxes, which are sort of a state by state thing. There's both a federal and a state level to it. But I'd say, depending on the state that you're in, you should expect to probably spend an extra $1,000 to $2,000 per employee on that, just based on sort of how the calculation works and again what state you're in and so on. That'll often be a front loaded cost, so you'll end up paying that off over the first couple of weeks or months of an employee, depending on what their pay rate is. But then that'll fall off after a certain cap, and then beyond that, as you just sort of go through it, the core question you have to really ask yourself here is this a stopgap employee, right? And the way I'll frame this is this a job? Am I hiring somebody to provide a service for as long as they are willing to do so in my business? And they are largely replaceable and interchangeable. So, I might be hiring a cashier, I might be hiring a front desk person, And with no disrespect to cashiers or front desk people, we just sort of, as business owners, have to anticipate that they are not going to spend the rest of their career working the register or answering the phones at the front desk. So, in those particular circumstances, you probably then just think about their hourly wages and rates, any state mandated benefits you have to provide if your company is big enough, and that's probably where you draw the line. Conversely, if you're hoping that there's a career here, then you're talking about a whole extra layer of cost.
Okay, so let's for this conversation stick on the career track. What are some of those additional costs? Are you thinking about things like training and salary and benefits?
Training is part of it, but let's even just start with sort of the pure economics here. So let's say you're going to have a position and it's going to pay, call it $100,000 a year, which is sort of a high number maybe for a first hire, but it depends on the role. But I'm really just going to use it to make the math here a lot easier. You should expect again that 7.65%, so $7,650 in additional payroll taxes on that person. So your $100,000 salary is now $106,000. I'm losing my math here, 750. That number is wrong. Oh, well, I'll live with it. You're spending, call it 107,000 on this person, and then you are then going to look at benefits. Okay, now there are benefits that cost money, and there are benefits that create opportunity costs. So let's talk opportunity costs first here. This would be your leave policies, your PTO, your vacation time, your sick leave, your maternity, paternity, military service, jury service, etc. policies. If your business is the type of business where effort goes in and money comes out, these do have a direct opportunity cost, because if you're, let's say, an hourly accounting practice, for every hour this person is on leave and you have to pay them, you not only are not making money, but you're also having to spend money. So there's a net negative to these policies, and you have to account for that in the costs. But if you're a recurring revenue business, so if you're a financial planning firm that does investments under management or subscription fees, technically speaking, when that person leaves, it doesn't cost you anything additional. You just have to reorganize your workflows and your team. Now, if you have enough work, you might have to hire somebody temporarily or backfill, depending on the period of leave, but there's no direct out-of-pocket cost because the revenue is still coming in to support that position while it's currently not being productive. When you get then over to hard dollar benefits, the biggest thing that I think about here in terms of compensation philosophy is how necessary is the benefit? So take something like health insurance. It's essentially a must in this country. You can find little niche cases where somebody doesn't need health insurance, or maybe they're married and they get it from their spouse. But generally speaking, you should be expecting that you're going to pay for health insurance or provide some degree of health insurance, because if you don't, what you're tacitly telling your employees is either get it somewhere else or pay for it on your own. And so that becomes a net negative to their take-home pay, in the sense that, if you have to pay the $400 a month or they have to pay the $400 a month, right, that then means that they are making more or less $4,800 a year based on just that particular policy or that particular cost. And so that can be a material impact to your employees. There are other benefits, and I think the funny thing here is you can provide kind of the full gamut of benefits outside of a retirement plan and health insurance for an incredibly nominal amount of money. You can provide life insurance for literally a couple dollars a month. You can provide disability insurance for a couple dollars a month, and on the upper end, maybe $30, $40, $50, $60 a month, depending on compensation levels or the occupation of the people in your business. You can provide vision and dental for an incredibly low amount of money. So you can have a very robust benefits package without breaking the bank. The two benefits that are really going to have a big economic outlay are going to be health insurance and a retirement plan.
All right. So if you make the conscious decision to hire an employee, you also need to find that employee. Is there a cost to recruiting or finding, an attractive candidate?
So it's interesting because there are professional recruiters. Professional recruiters might charge you anywhere from 10% to 25% of the first year salary for this role. So hiring this person who makes $100,000, you might have to pay a recruiter $10,000 to $25,000 to find them. I am sort of skeptical about this area. And the reason I'm skeptical about this area, and this is not a dig on recruiters, some positions genuinely require like talented professionals to fill, particularly when you think about really high touch positions, like you're trying to hire a CEO CEO to take over a company. So you not only have to hire a very expensive employee, but also the cost of getting it wrong is enormous. So it makes sense to invest heavily in making sure you've done really good due diligence. But in the terms of hiring, I think realistically hiring is actually in many industries very easy. It tends to be a problem with how the recruitment process works. So a typical job posting I'll see for many companies will look something like this. We are seeking this role. Let's say we're seeking a staff accountant to work at our firm. Our firm is great and awesome. Here are our list of minimum qualifications. Here's our list of preferred qualifications. Compensation is competitive. Benefits provided. Apply here. And when you think about what that is a very poor set of signals to a potential candidate, because what they just read or what they just saw was essentially a thing that said, we're hiring for this job title. We, the company, are great in generic terms. Here are minimum requirements that might really be maximum requirements, and here are preferred requirements that might be completely unrealistic for the marketplace. We're not going to send you any information about really compensation. We just say something like, again, compensation is competitive, benefits provided, and that's not a strong set of signals. So compare that, for example, to an admin position we listed last year that we filled. The position listed out, here is the position, the nature of the position, right? It's a low to moderate effort position because it's administration in a financial services office. You're not going to be breaking a sweat. It is a great fit for somebody who is currently pursuing concurrent education or who is looking to get their first set of experience in the financial services industry. Here is a list of the basic responsibilities of the position, and they are not super duper high thresholds by any means, right? Watering plants, checking the mail, answering the phone, taking notes, not hugely difficult things. Here are our minimum requirements. And minimum requirements were literally high school diploma, speak, read, and write English, ability to lift 25 pounds. That's it. That's all we asked for. Preferred qualifications, prior experience in financial services or prior experience in customer service roles and positions. And then beyond that, compensation. Here's the salary range explicitly stated. Here are the benefits laid out point by point. Here's the health insurance. Here's the life insurance. Here's the disability insurance. Here's the vision. Here's the dental. Here's all of that. Here's the leave policy. Here's the vacation policy. Here's the sick policy. Here's the maternity, paternity benefits. Here's a copy of our compensation guide and our benefits guide. Here's a explanation of our career path and our career track. Right. And then at the very bottom, just a little blurb. Hey, we're a field financial planning firm in Longmont, Colorado. Okay. Think about the difference in signals there, right? The first job posting essentially said, we have a lot of demands of you, and if you apply, we can talk about rewards. The other job posting essentially said, hey, almost anybody can apply for this position. The compensation is significant and detailed, right? And by the way, this is a great fit for people who might worry that it may not be a fit for them because they don't have experience or are not, really, really well tenured people in this particular field. We'd prefer experience, but we're not requiring it. It's not a necessity. So back to your core question, right? Like, what are the costs of hiring? If you have a really strong set of signals, not very high. Posting to platforms like Indeed or LinkedIn can be essentially free or incredibly low cost. Sharing it with your network, incredibly low cost. It only gets very expensive when either A, your signals are weak, right? B, your signals are strong, but your ranges are inappropriate, right? So you're trying to hire somebody with 5 years of experience at entry-level wages. C, and this is the more challenging part, you're in an undesirable area, right? We live in the middle of nowhere, Nebraska. Okay, you're just going to have a hard time because you probably don't have a local qualified for a lot of the work you might be trying to fill, and so you're going to have to attract somebody to move. So now we need to really overcompensate to make that shift make sense for those people. And then finally, you can utilize a recruiter, you can utilize specialists. Some of them are out there, are great at what they do and can really help with it. But I think in many cases, you are going to end up overpaying for a recruiter. And it's not that they're overpaid, personally, it's not that their work isn't worth it, but you're overpaying relative to the cost of just getting basic hiring fundamentals right.
That's excellent. I remember vividly when I was applying to this position, one of the things that stood out to me was just apples to apples, comparing it to other financial planning positions. The job description was just considerably more descriptive than the rest of them. And I remember just appreciating that, being a individual looking for a position out of school, a lot of these positions are, salary commensurate with experience is the big phrase out there, and it's frustrating, for a lot of folks because they just want to know, hey, is this something I can pursue or not? And it's very frustrating to see a lot of that, and I definitely appreciated the fact that you outlined it in a lot of detail. I do have one final question on this topic here. I do want to wrap it up, however. So say you hire an employee and it's, a long-term investment you're making in this individual. You're excited about them starting, they seem like they're a really great individual, but then they start and, it's not what you expected. Maybe they're not performing up to your standard, or they're just not the person you thought they were. How long of a runway do you give them before you start to have a conversation with yourself on, maybe I made a bad investment and I need to reinvest into a different person?
So you need to be very clear in your communication. I think one of the number one mistakes managers and leaders make is doing reviews on an annual basis and in arrears, where essentially we hire somebody and we have feelings, we have thoughts, we have kind of critiques and feedback, we have things we'd like to see them improve, and we save that all up for a conversation at the end of the year. Also, it happens to be around the time we're setting budgets and giving raises, so on and so forth. Nobody does a bad job intentionally, right? And I'll point out the obvious exclusion here. Right? There are just some people who are malfeasant, bad employees, and that's its own thing. Nobody who's showing up to work with a good attitude and who wants to grow in their career is doing a bad job on purpose. So as an employer, if you have an employee who's not meeting your expectation, you do them no service and you do your firm a disservice by failing to communicate those expectations. I think a really good rule when it comes to employees is if you have a conversation about an employee, right, whether it's with a coworker, a colleague, one of your other employees, and you're sitting there and just going like, yeah, this Daniel guy, I don't know if he gets it, right? He's just not clicking. I'm just not sure that he's the right fit. The problem is that a lot of people will have that conversation and internalize it, and they won't say anything to the person. They won't go to them and say, hey, listen, I've had a conversation. I've been thinking about it, whatever it is, about your performance in this area, right? And I don't think you understand how to do this job, or I don't think you're, completing things in a timely manner, whatever the problem is. And so here's what I'd like to propose or do to support you in this to be more successful at it. Okay. So the balance here is you do really have to lay out the path for an employee to be successful, because if they're doing a bad job, they probably don't know they're doing a bad job, right? Or if they're not being successful, they probably don't know that they're not being successful in it or not meeting your standards. So you need to communicate that and support them, whether it's via training, whether it's via direct interventions, or whatever is required to help them in that. But the trick there is you can tell them once and try to realign expectations. If it fails to improve from there, you can set a more strict, like, here's what I need to see from you standard, right? I need to see X metrics met by this time. But then at that point, you have to ultimately accept that all failures on the part of employees tend to be failures of leadership, right? It's a failure to train, it's a failure to educate, it's a failure to empower, or it's a failure to set reasonable expectations. And if you get to the end of the line and there's just no improvement in that area, then at that point it makes sense to look at it. But I think you have to be a little bit more patient than you might otherwise expect. But I'll put out one sort of final thought on this, which is I think any tenured manager or trainer can tell the difference between somebody who's trying and not succeeding and somebody who's not putting in any effort. If you have the former, right, some person who's trying and not succeeding, really communicate, really work with them, try to get them to a place where they're successful, and you'll reap the benefits of that. If it's a person who's just not putting forth any effort, cut the rope faster, sooner than later. Don't drag your feet on it. Don't torture this person and yourself by holding on to somebody that you have every confidence is not going to be successful.
Yeah, I think once upon a time I heard a quote that said, take your time in hiring. So hire slow, make sure you hire the right person, but hire if, they're not meeting your standards and you've communicated everything well already and are still not receptive to the feedback. So go on.
Oh, I was just thinking about when I worked at IBM before as a financial planner. There were people who struggled and we had to retrain all the time, and there were people who struggled and you could tell, from the first retraining attempt that this person was not going to click. And it was painful on everybody's part to then have to spend the next several weeks or months essentially playing the hoop jumping game to make the decision to let that person go or convince their manager to let that person go, which, by the way, is not a fun exercise. It's not fun to be the party of, hey, fire that guy. Because you are a villain in somebody's life when you do that, but you have a responsibility to the organization, to the broader team. And I think the impacts of letting a poor performer hang around for a long time are broader than just their lack of productivity, because the people around them can see it and feel it.
So moving on here, we charge 0.5% of net worth on an annualized basis for our ongoing financial planning engagements. Because of this, for some of our small business owner clients, we do some very light valuations to give them a quote for their respective net worth. Whether it's your own business or you're valuing a potential business to buy, valuing a business is tricky. There are multiple ways to go about it, some of which are more effective than others for our industry. But, for someone who does own a business or is looking to, invest in one, what are some of the opportunities, or not even opportunities, some of the ways they can go about calculating what their business is worth?
I think there's a couple of very, very basic, very rudimentary rules of thumb that can be applied here. And before I start talking about those, I'm just going to hold up a little white flag in the direction of my professional business valuation experts, the CPA firms that do this type of work and so on. You're all amazing. You all are gonna tear out your hair here over the next couple minutes as I generalize quite a bit. Please keep in mind, I'm just generalizing here. These are just things that people can use to get an approximation, but full recognition and acknowledgement right at the start that when it comes time to really sell a business and get serious at selling a business, evaluation is absolutely appropriate when handled by a professional, and that needs to be done. So with that disclaimer out of the way, I think a couple of ways to approach this. Number one, if the business is transactional versus recurring. So, for example, Netflix is a recurring business, right? Every month you pay a subscription. You have these unlimited contracts that go on forever. You can raise your prices unilaterally occasionally, and you'll gain or lose subscribers in that model, but you can comfortably say that there's going to be X, millions of dollars of revenue coming into the business every day. Conversely, something like a coffee shop is transactional. Right, you may have a very steady, healthy flow of customers. You build models and predictions based on sort of the number of cups you sell every day of this and that and so on. And you hire people and give raises and make investments in the business based on those expectations. But there's no contract that you can make with any customer that expects that they're going to walk in every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and buy a vanilla latte. So it's a highly transactional type of business. You have to figure out very quickly how much of your revenue is transactional versus recurring. Okay. When it's transactional, that's going to result in a significant discount of the value of the business. It can still be very valuable, but it would not be nearly as valuable as if every customer was on subscription, was in a contract that created recurring revenue. So that's just one factor to account for. In the financial planning field, for example, transactional revenue is often valued at something like a quarter or half of 1 year's revenue. So, if you do $200,000 of sales in life insurance, that might be valued at $50,000 to $100,000, versus if it was $200,000 of investment advisory revenue that's ongoing and recurring, that might be valued at something more like $400,000 to $600,000. So there's a substantial difference in the multiples around profitability. The other thing is to just contemplate how much of the value of your business is in its physical, tangible assets or its intellectual property versus its ability to generate revenue through ongoing services. So let's say you have a construction company and you're a big construction company. You've got all the bulldozers and the backhoes and cranes and all that sort of stuff. A huge portion of your value is just going to be book value. How much, if all the staff and employees were taken away and the company was just for sale on an auction lot, how much is all the stuff worth? So that can kind of create a hard floor value, right? The tangible assets are the tangible assets, and they have sort of a concrete value. On the other side of that, right, if your business is much more service oriented, then we're probably looking at valuation much more heavily based on the streams and flows of revenue and the ratios of direct expense, what we pay staff to deliver the services, the ratios of overhead, right? The cost of the office and the software and the lights and the insurance and and all that sort of stuff, and how much profit flows through. Because to give you the example here, if I sell a financial planning practice for that's doing $1 million of revenue for a 2x multiple, so $2 million, and the net profit of the practice is, let's say, $400,000, on an annual basis, then I can reasonably expect that I'm going to get my money back after 5 years, plus or minus the cost of financing for that transaction. And that, so long as we retain the staff, retain the clients, and continue to provide the services, that's a self-funding transaction. But if I buy a life insurance office that's doing $2 million in commission sales a year, that's great. It's the same amount of revenue, but I don't have nearly the same level of surety that we're going to continue to get the same sales and bring in the same number of customers to sell those policies. So again, that transactional versus recurring element is important. And then the dynamics of where the value in the business comes from is really important. For our purposes, we tend to be very, very conservative in our valuations. We tend to just look at balance sheet value and then really probably no more than 1 year of recurring revenue. And if it's a transactional type of business, half of a year's transactional business as far as revenue goes. So that's going to produce a very conservative valuation, but that's healthy for financial planning for a couple of different reasons.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought of differentiating between transactional and recurring businesses for their different valuations. So if you have a small business, is it something you need to do frequently, get the value or the business valued, or is that something you really only do if you want to sell?
No, you don't need to do it regularly unless you're trying to engage in a particular legal exercise. So, for example, let's say we'll use a coffee shop example. You've got a coffee shop on one side of Main Street. Somebody else has a coffee shop on the other side of Main Street. You're both friendly. You both do a good business. You're not stealing customers from each other or anything crazy like that. But you both realize, hey, nobody in my family would want to run this coffee shop if I died. So we're going to have a conversation, decide, hey, we're gonna engage some attorneys and we're gonna go ahead and do a buy-sell agreement. If you suddenly pass away, I'll buy your coffee shop, and if I suddenly pass away, you'll buy my coffee shop, and we'll buy some life insurance to fund it and go through those sort of mechanisms. From that standpoint, the value of doing that really then creates an element where we do probably want to get a professional valuation of the business, but professional valuations are going to be expensive. We're talking $5,000-$10,000 at least to start, even for a small mom and pop shop or something like that. So keep in mind that it's not money you just want to throw out there every year to get done, because there's not such a huge return on it to make it make sense. But if you're going to engage in a legal process to create a potential transaction, you want to make sure you have a fair value in mind there. And then, as you start thinking about how you're going to have a succession plan, right? How are you going to retire? Are you going to sell the entire business? Are you going to sell stock to the employees and make it employee owned? Are you going to bring in partners? And if so, are you just giving them equity or are they buying in? Those are all really good reasons to get real valuations done. But for your own personal planning purposes, I think just applying some very conservative expectations around the value of your business is helpful when you think about how you're going to one day get the equity out of the business. And you have to be deliberate and thoughtful about that, because only about 10% of businesses survive their original owner.
Okay, you're getting a little ahead of yourself there with the succession. We're almost there. But before we get there, you mentioned something that I think transitions nicely into the third topic here, which is retirement benefits for business owners. So you mentioned how a lot of business owners, they tend to have a lot of the majority of their net worth tied to this business. So very similar to how individuals have the majority of their net worth, for the most part, tied to their personal home. And that's tricky because a lot of individuals and families struggle to tap into that equity and utilize it to fund their retirement. And I'd say that can be very similar for a lot of business owners as well. So, can you explain to me why maybe just having a business and being a business owner is not sufficient for funding retirement for most folks?
Sure. So, number one, that statistic, right? Only about 1 in 10 businesses are going to survive the owner. A lot of businesses suffer from a couple of fatal flaws when it comes to the ability to extract value. Number one, almost any solo practice is going to be borderline impossible to sell, because essentially all the goodwill and value of the business is in the owner and the relationships and that they have with their customers and vendors and so on. So, let's say you're a great photographer. Selling your photography business as a solo photographer is going to be almost impossible, because unless you bring on somebody as sort of an apprentice who really learns the trade from you over the years and takes the time to really build up the skill set and build goodwill with the customers, most customers are going to be like, well, you were a great photographer, but I don't really know the new guy and I don't really have any reason to work with them other than your say so. So I'm going to shop around and look around. And you might be able to transition some repeat customers to that photographer, but there's just not a lot of value in that business. But if you owned a photography company with 20, 30, 40 photographers and 5 or 6 support staff who set appointments and help lug the equipment around, and you've got really good marketing and search engine optimization and so on, then there's a more tangible asset there. The other case can be regulatory. It's easy to sell something like let's say, a small construction business or a home cleaning business. But if you are, let's say, a neurosurgeon and you have a neurosurgical clinic, you're subject to a huge amount of regulations. And bottom line, you're not going to be able to sell that to anybody else other than another neurosurgeon, or at the very least, another medical provider that has a neurosurgeon on staff, because the work and the value that your clinic provides is derived from your unique licensed skill set that's very valuable in the first place. So there's sort of a challenge there where sometimes, just because of how valuable the skill set is, it can be very hard to transition. Past that, as you then get into things like just sort of the value of the enterprise, a lot of businesses run sort of out of the top of the head of the business owner, right? So it's a small accounting practice. You've got an admin, you've got maybe a junior tax preparer, and then the owner who's also the senior. And the process for the firm is clients bring in their stuff, and an organizer and the junior preparer, plugs in as much of the data as they can and then hands it to the senior, and the senior sort of ties it all up and gets the return done. That's a basic system and process, but the second you pull out the senior, pull out the junior in that scenario, that process breaks down. And so the lack of systemization and workflows that show that the business can survive past the original owner is a really big piece of the value puzzle. It's interesting because there's a big trend right now, particularly from like Wharton MBAs and Harvard Business School MBAs, that instead of going into investment banking or tech, they're going into small businesses and trying to buy up HVAC companies or plumbers, that sort of thing. And the trick there is that all those acquisitions are highly dependent on the existing professionals in the business staying there and the business having enough systems in place that the owner retiring doesn't derail it. But in a solo shop or in a super duper small shop where maybe there's only one plumber or one HVAC tech and maybe the one junior, there's not enough of a system in place there to really create the continuity for the business to thrive unless the buyer has the same skill set, so they are also an HVAC person or also a plumber or something like that.
Okay, so sounds like 90% of businesses are going to struggle to extract value if they retire from the business because they're not going to be able to sell it or transfer it to somebody else. So let's say a business owner sees the writing on the wall here and he says, hey, I should probably start saving elsewhere for longer term goals. Are there opportunities or ways that business owners can do that that are unique to them?
So, I mean, functionally, business owners have the best tax planning flexibility in the world. How they go about that is its own set of discussions. But to lay it out simply, they have access to the same traditional IRAs and Roth IRAs everybody else does. If they're being successful as a business owner, they're going to need something more robust. So, a typical sequence of retirement plan selection that I'll see for a business owner will be a solo 401k, which is going to have sort of the best contribution limits and flexibility. For a self-employed individual, maybe their spouse works in the business, but an individual who doesn't have any employees, when they hire employees, they then will often switch to a SEP IRA. They'll switch to that because it lets them exclude their employees for up to 3 years. So then they're able to keep saving for their own retirement without having to pay for anybody else's. When they get to the end of the SEP, depending on how they want to grow their business, they might switch to a simple IRA, which is sort of baby's first 401k. It has lower contribution limits, has lower matching requirements, and the compliance costs are very low, although the administration of them tends to be a pain in practice just because there are really not good support systems in the technology space through brokerage institutions to support those accounts. And then finally, they'll probably end up with something like an actual 401k plan, typically a safe harbor plan, where their matching contributions are really capped at either 3 or 4%, depending on the formulas they select. And the plan is reasonably self-running from an administration standpoint.
That's a whole different conversation we can get into, is the various advantages or ways that business owners can save for their retirement. But one final piece I wanted to talk about here is, I think there's a lot of business owners who might listen to a conversation like this. They have a long enough runway where they can still plan to transfer the business to somebody else one day. And they look at investing in, outside of their business and they say, well, I know my business. I have this sum of money. If I invested in my business, I can generate X return hypothetically, and that's a greater return than I would get from, say, SEP IRA or one of these other retirement vehicles. If you're a business owner, how do you navigate or have that conversation with yourself?
Sure. I think a good example here would be an example I've actually given in lectures at the local college a couple of times. So our good friend, Dr. Chris McGilvray, has had me come in and teach his class when he was teaching Intro to Business many times, specifically around starting businesses and transitioning out of businesses. And I always used Dr. Chris as the example because Dr. Chris also happens to own a liquor store. So here's sort of the thing you can think about. Reinvesting in a business is one of the best high risk, high reward activities you can engage in from an investment standpoint because, the risk is very concentrated. It is the singular business entity, the singular business activity and enterprise. And conversely, then because the risk is so high, you should be demanding or expecting a much greater level of reward by extension from that. So if you're reinvesting in your business, that's great and wonderful, but that level of risk can't be understated. So Dr. Chris owns a liquor store, and the examples I would give is what if he no longer wants to work in the store physically? Now he has to depend on employees. The margins of the store would be squeezed quite heavily by trying to hire somebody in a management role to take over the day-to-day activity of actually managing the store, right? Buying the inventory, stocking the shelves, deciding who to hire and fire, setting shifts, all of that, because you can't fill that role for minimum wage. On the other end of that, there's also regulatory risk, right? In Colorado, we have a lot of protections for small liquor store owners, but in that particular example, right, all it takes is a couple of laws to be passed to open it up so that Costco and Safeway and King Soopers and all of them can sell hard liquor and beer and wine. It takes not too much legislatively to create a world in which you can get delivery from restaurants for alcohol and so on, where suddenly, sort of the micro localized monopoly you had maybe over your street or your neighborhood as kind of the only liquor store that's allowed to be there is suddenly being beaten via economies of scale by bigger companies. So it's one of those things where you can make the decision, hey, I'm going to reinvest heavily in my small business, and if the business does well, if the environment stays favorable throughout that time, then that's going to produce a really outsized return, much greater than you probably would have gotten by putting money in your 401k or your Roth. But comes back to the risk. How much of your wealth do you want to concentrate in this particular enterprise that is not only your source of income, but also your only source of significant wealth in that particular case, versus diversifying away from it and trying to spread out the amount of money that you have coming in from one source versus where you're reinvesting that money?
I think thinking about the level of risk for the return you're taking on in this context is a really good point you bring up, and I think it leads nicely into the succession and transition planning that you mentioned earlier. So, as you said, almost 90% of businesses are going to have a really difficult time with this. If a business owner does want to consider selling their business at a certain point, how early should they start thinking about this and looking for somebody?
I think they should be thinking about this at least a decade in advance. And that seems like a lot of time, but you're going to get the best bang for your buck in a succession plan by planning well ahead, valuing well ahead, and laying out a path in which you can perform an internal succession. An internal succession here would be hiring somebody, or bringing somebody in and saying, hey, over the next 5-10 years, we're going to get you trained up and prepared to buy the business or start buying the business out or becoming a partner of the business, so that that person has a lot of time to learn the business, learn the systems, learn the processes, and then you can let them use the profits of the business essentially to self-fund the acquisition, where they might take out a loan from a bank to give you a lump sum value for all of the business value or a big portion of the value, or portions being paid out over years, and then can steadily use the profits of the business to pay for that while still working in the business to earn a take-home income that they can actually live on. That's going to result in probably the best transition and the best retention of the assets, the talent, and so on within the business. That can create a lot of value for the employees, because maybe it's not just one person. Maybe you're going to become employee owned and open up the opportunity to a lot of other employees within the company to become partners, become owners. And that's going to create a lot of goodwill within the organization, both for the employees and the customers of the business. Conversely, if you are looking more to just get out quickly at a certain point, that's fine. But then you often run into kind of transaction risks that'll affect the valuation. So typically, a valuation and a transactional purchase might run anywhere from 1 year out to 6, 7, 8 years. The faster you get your money, the less you're going to get paid for your business because now the buyers are carrying more of the risk. The slower you get your money, the more money you're going to be paid for the risk that the new owners drive it into the ground, or that there's an opportunity cost that occurs there. And so within that, you also will likely have higher transactional costs. You might have to hire a business broker along the way. You might have more financing costs that you're bearing some of the cost for, and the risk is protracted. So it's like anything, right? If we spend a decade preparing for this thing, it's probably going to go really well for us by comparison to something that we decide we're going to try to figure out in a year or two.
So recently you had me read the book G2 by Philip Palaviv, and it talked a lot about this succession. And I'm going to butcher the analogy a little bit, so I do apologize. But in the beginning of the book, there was a business owner talking about selling his business. And he said, I've built this beautiful painting, and I would love to, bring somebody in who can work on the painting and, continue to improve it. And another business owner said, well, the successor doesn't want to paint on your painting. They want to create their own painting, meaning, they have their own ideas and ways of doing things that are different than the way you do things. If you're looking for a successor, should you be open to them, exploring new things, or should you want to find somebody more in line with what you're currently doing?
So I think somebody open to doing new things is perfectly fine, or somebody who wants to do it your way is also fine. Because if the business is going to be fully sold, it's not your problem anymore, right? So if you say, hey, today we do this net worth based calculation, we provide a really high touch service, but I'm buying the firm, and when I buy the firm, I want to go for high volume, lower touch. I want to serve more people but do less. Okay, you bought the business. That's your call. It's not my problem anymore. I think a lot of conflicts and issues with succession that can be caused by what you're describing are when it's sort of a partial succession. The partial succession being something where somebody says, hey, you're going to buy 30% from me, and I'm going to stay majority shareholder, and I'm still going to get paid majority of the profits, but I'm going to start slowly retiring. And then maybe another 5 or 10 years down the road, you can buy another 30% from me. And so that creates frustrations on both sides because the owner has an incentive for the thing to be as profitable as possible and to just keep doing less and less work. And the minority shareholder here, or the junior partner, doesn't have any power, right? Like, they have an entitlement to profits, but they don't have the ability to make changes unilaterally. They can't fire the business owner out of the practice. They can't, even though they're doing a lot of the work, they can't push them out necessarily. They can threaten poison pills, right? If you don't get out of my way, I'm going to leave, or if you don't let me do this, I'm going to quit, or something like that. But that just becomes sort of the limitation.
Interesting. And, I think one final point I wanted to touch upon here is, uh, obviously the succession is important, but do you think there's some businesses that shouldn't have a succession and are better off saying, when I'm done, it's done?
I think if you are getting to the last minute decision that you're going to retire and you're thinking about how do I sell my business and you haven't done any of the groundwork, it doesn't hurt to sort of throw out the flag there and say, hey, I've got a small business. Anybody would want to buy it? But I'll be frank, I've seen a lot of business owners that are solo shops that don't have systems and processes try to sell or really delay their own retirement in the hopes that a sale is going to happen. And the consequence that often arises then is they just sort of spin their wheels for a couple of years. I think if you haven't done the groundwork to sell your business and you don't have something of significant value, right? Your business is, let's say, only worth the income you take from it, and you only make really $30,000 or $40,000 a year doing it, it's probably just going to be better to just close up shop there and cut your opportunity costs versus really trying to find a buyer for this super duper small enterprise and going through all the heartburn and heartache of selling this thing to somebody and training them and transitioning it and so on.
All right. I think we made up for a lot of lost time here, Dan. I appreciate it.
Sure. But I'm never going to let you off the hook. So, Daniel, what have you learned in the last couple of weeks? What does our audience need to know?
I might have said this once before, but it's something that I think has come up recently again, which is interesting. Is we work in an industry where we are expected to be experts in financial planning, and that puts I wouldn't it puts a stress or an expectation on you as the professional. However, that being said, there's been multiple times where my answer to a client is simply, I don't know. However, I'll find the answer for you. And I think that's been valuable for me because I've had a little bit of a mindset shift from the client expects me to know everything under the sun to, I don't know everything. However, we have resources and the ability to find the answer, and we'll still get you that answer in a promptly. And I think for me, that's been important to realize because yes, I do want to become an expert and I want to be knowledgeable in all things finance. However, at the same time, having that understanding you're not going to be an expert in everything is pretty important.
The Science of Wealth is produced by My Wealth Planners, a registered investment advisor in Colorado. The theme song is This Is Your Time by Dan Phillips. The podcast is intended for educational purposes only and is not investment advice or any other form of advice. Not all material discussed on the podcast is appropriate for every individual in every circumstance, so you should consult with a certified financial planner, tax professional, or legal professional as appropriate before attempting to apply any of the subjects, strategies, or tactics discussed on the podcast.